Hi, welcome to the lecture on World War II. This is going to cover a world war, and I really like to use this map that's on the screen here to really highlight how large this war is. We will never have another war as large as this. We may kill more people in the future, but there will never be a war on this scale in terms of the millions of people involved and the fact that it spanned the entire globe. If you look on this map here, you can see, focusing on North America, the entire United States economy is set to build everything that is needed to fight this war and mobilize 13 million soldiers and airmen and sailors to fight this war. And then if we move further to the east, the Atlantic Ocean, the U-boat war is being fought there. Millions of tons of shipping being sunk over the course of this war. Europe, of course, is the center of this war, with Germany invading France and the other countries there, and then later into the Soviet Union. But North Africa as well, spanning from Morocco across to Egypt, and then the Middle East are hotbeds of this war. Persia, about 50,000 Americans are going to serve in Persia, helping make sure that supplies that the Soviets need to fight this war are able to make it there. And then going across India, on the eastern edge of India, the Japanese are invading there. Americans are going to be fighting mostly air war, bombing in Burma, Vietnam, China throughout this war. China is the bloodiest part of this entire war. Millions of civilians, as we'll see in the final slide here, are killed in the course of this war. And then, of course, all the way across the Pacific Ocean, back around to Pearl Harbor. And really, on the west coast of the United States, the Japanese do carry out some small attacks and take the islands of the Aleutians, several of the islands. And so this war is going to require everything that America can bring to the table. And the war only ends the way it does because America does that. But when we enter the war, it's a very dark period of time. The Battle of the Atlantic that I mentioned is sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of ships per month. And you can see on this chart here, we are entering at the worst point in 1942. The Germans are trying to starve Britain to death, and they very nearly do it. Then across North Africa, it looks like the Germans are winning there. And it also looks like they're winning in the Soviet Union, although it's pretty clear by this point, looking backwards, that they aren't going to win. It's unknown at the time. And so we enter at a very dark period of time. And if we go back to the attack on Pearl Harbor and remember what the Japanese plan was, the goal was to knock America back to get 6 months or a year in order to fight in the Pacific, seize the area with the resources that they need, and then hold and sue for peace with the Americans. They knew they couldn't defeat America, but they thought if they could solidify their position, they would be able to negotiate a settlement to that. They didn't anticipate the anger that would come from this attack on Pearl Harbor. From the American perspective, we were in the midst of treaty negotiations or an attempt to settle our differences, and out of the blue, to most Americans, there was this attack on Pearl Harbor and thousands of people were killed and the Pacific Fleet heavily damaged. Now, for the American people, by 1941, most people understood they were going to war. Most people, if you look at polling, the numbers had shifted dramatically over the course of late 1940 into 1941. They understand they're going to war, or they're going to be drawn into this war, but the assumption is they're going to war with Germany because that was the big threat. Japan was sort of off the radar, except for some sanctions that we're carrying against them. But there's no anticipation we're going to go to war with Japan. But the war is brought to us by Japan, And from many Americans' perspective, that needs to be the one we take care of. They attacked us and we must take them out. From FDR's perspective, however, Germany is the greatest threat. And at the Atlantic Conference earlier, 1941, he and Churchill had agreed that if it came to war, or America entering the war, that the focus would be Germany. They were the greatest threat, and then we would deal with Japan later. Now, the way the war started for America, though, changes that, and the American people want to take care of Japan now. And so, although he would like to put all the resources towards Germany, he's really going to be pushed into allotting greater resources towards the Pacific than he might otherwise want. Now, unbeknownst to us at the time, by May of 1942, the Japanese have reached their peak. Remember, they wanted 6 months to a year. They got almost exactly 6 months. And that's because of a couple of sea battles that take place. And after that point, Japan is no longer going to be able to hold on. It's going to be a long, slow drag trying to defeat them. But they've reached the high water mark. And so those two battles are the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. Coral Sea takes place during a Japanese attempt to move down on the northern part of Australia. The two fleets never come in contact, the American fleet and the Japanese fleet. It is all aircraft carriers attacking aircraft carriers. It's the first time that that's happened. And both sides suffer losses in that attack. The problem is we can rebuild those, and we'll see here in a moment the productive capacity of America, which is a key reason the war turns out like it does. We can replace those losses, the lost ships and the lost men. Japan cannot replace those losses from the Battle of Coral Sea, and in fact, they needed those ships for the upcoming plan, which was to take the island of Midway, sort of northwest from the island of Hawaii. And so their next major move was to go take that island, and that was going to be their holding spot. They sent their fleet there to do it, but they were short because of the losses at the Battle of Coral Sea. And then once again at the Battle of Midway, the two fleets don't come in direct contact. It is all aircraft carrier planes against aircraft carrier planes. And once again, both sides are going to suffer losses, but the Japanese are going to lose 4 aircraft carriers. Now, if you're going to fight a war in the Pacific, in 1940s, the aircraft carrier is the critical piece of equipment. And when we start the war, the Japanese have more than us. They've got something like 10 or 12, and we've got slightly less than that. Now, by the end of the war, we have over 100 aircraft carriers. By the end of the war, the Japanese have none. They've lost all the ones they had, and they are not able to build new ones. And so again, it goes to the productive capacity of the United States. They lost 4 carriers, and this was such a devastating loss to the Japanese Navy that they refused to even admit it to the emperor or to the army, which was their rival. The Japanese people don't even know that those 4 carriers have gone down for about a year or more. They kept it secret because it was such a devastating loss, and they would lose face in the nation. And so after those 2 battles, the Japanese are never again going to be strong enough to win this war or do what they wanted, which was to hold for at least a year. That's not going to happen. But it's going to take a long time to drive them back across the Pacific in order to defeat them. And so if we look at this map here, you can see the Battle of Midway up there in June 1942. The very rapid advance after December 7th, when they attack into Indonesia and Malaysia and very quickly take all that area. The Battle of Coral Sea, just north of Australia. That was that critical battle the month prior. And that really is the high watermark, that yellow line there. From that point on, we're going to be fighting to push them back. Now, in order to fight this war, we are going to have to organize at a level that we have never done before. We had some practice in World War I in mobilizing the economy, and by that I mean everything has to be controlled. We have a free market today, but in World War II, in order to make things happen, it is all run by the government. Now, the companies are still private companies, but the allocation of resources, the things that are going to be produced, all of those are directed by the government. And we create a war production board in order to oversee all of that. We got to make sure that the right things are produced at the right time so that we can achieve the victory on the battlefield. For instance, I can't build bombers before I build training aircraft, and before I build the training aircraft, I need to build the schools to train the pilots, and I need to build the airports for them to fly off on. And so all of that has to be sequenced. And you can think of that across all aspects of the economy. You can see these cartoons here mobilizing the entire populace. And a number of changes come out of the economy as a result of that. The whole idea of workers' health insurance coming from your company comes out of this war. Before this, people didn't have health insurance typically. But because we are controlling the entire economy, it meant a number of things. Number one, you couldn't just quit your job and go off to another job. If you're in a war industry, you can only leave that job if you're going to another war industry. You can't just quit your job. And those businesses were controlled on how much they could pay you additional money. We got a price administration, wage administration, all of that is controlled. We have rationing of all goods. And so one way that companies could attract workers was to offer them benefits because they couldn't offer greater pay. And so health insurance became a thing that they could offer you to get you from one war industry to another war industry. The other thing that comes out of this is the idea of tax withholding, taking money out of your paycheck every week in order to send that money to Washington. We can't wait till April for you to pay your taxes. We need that today. And so we're going to take it out, and we still do that to the present day, even though the war's been long over. Another major thing that's going to come out of this war is defense industries are going to move down to the South and to the West. And for the South, it means it's going to drag them out of the Civil War. They've been in a sort of economic malaise. They've made recovery since the end of the Civil War, but it's been slowed down for a number of reasons that we've talked about throughout the semester. And this is going to put so much economic activity down there in the South, building forts like Fort Hood to train people, building factories to produce bombers, jeeps, all of those things, and then all the industries that go along with it are going to set up the South for success after World War II. So you can see up in this chart up in the corner the amount of federal spending as a percentage of the entire economy. And so you can see from 1900, the federal spending was a very small part of the economy. And then World War I, it bumped up, but then dropped really rapidly. And then you can see this bump up for World War II. Nearly 50% of the GDP is dedicated to fighting this war. What's the rest of the country doing? Supporting that effort, right? So the entire economy is mobilized in some fashion towards fighting this war. These charts here show a lot of what I'm talking about. This is the productive capacity of America on a number of charts. If we look on the upper left-hand side there, manufacturing output, just understand what that means. In 1939, let's say we had 100% of our industrial capacity, By 1943, we've more than doubled the industrial capacity. That's what that chart means. And then the one below it, spending, you can see this massive uptick in spending. 1942, we got to build all those airfields, the barracks, all of that stuff. The spending goes down because we've already built a lot of the stuff we need for the war, but still far exceeds anything we've ever done before. Military personnel, you can see before the war, we had a couple 100,000 people. By 1945, we have roughly 12 million people. Now, that doesn't count the numbers who have already been killed or wounded and have left the service for whatever reason. It's about 13 million people are drafted into the military. You can't join the military, you have to be drafted. And the reason is because industrial production is as important as fighting the war. So we don't want a guy who's working in a factory building airplanes being patriotic and joining the Marines, and our production of airplanes slows down. So everybody was controlled in that respect. Now, the one below it is the one I really want you to pay attention to, and this is military aircraft production. And if you look at that, you can see 1939, barely any airplanes produced. By 1944, we are producing almost 100,000 planes per year. And I want you to think about what that takes. 100,000 planes per year. I don't think we probably make 1,000 planes per year in this country today. There's 100,000 planes, bombers, fighters, all sorts of planes. Now, if we're going to produce 100,000 planes per year, what does that take? All the material that goes into that. But we also have to produce 100,000 pilots, maybe 50,000 co-pilots, 50,000 navigators, the ground crew, all of that. We have to produce the airports for all of those planes to fly out of and train at. Texas becomes one of the main hubs for all of that activity. If you drive around Texas, there's airports all over that were built for World War II. You know, you look at some little small town here in the middle of Texas and you're like, why do they have an airport? It's because of World War II, most likely. And so if we look at the numbers compared to every other country in the world, this particular chart is comparing Britain, Germany, and Japan. But if we added on the Soviet Union, the same idea would hold. America produces more airplanes than everybody else combined, right? So when I'm saying 100,000, that is more than anybody else can produce in a year altogether, all of those people. And that is one of the key reasons why we're so successful. Just as another example, America produces a Jeep. The Germans had a similar thing they called a Kugelwagen. Now, in the entire course of the war, which for them was longer, they produced about 50,000 Kugelwagen. During the war, we produced 500,000 Jeeps. Again, the scale of difference there is just immense. And then the last chart down there is production of ships. And you can see we're producing a few ships in 1939 in terms of tonnage. By 1943, we are pumping out 10,000 tons at a time. And the thing is, we're going to lose a lot of ships, but we can more than replace every one of those ships, probably produce 2 or 3 ships for every one that's sunk. Japan cannot replace them. And by the end of the war, they are going to be out of ships. Science as well is going to be harnessed for this war in a way that had never been before. Now, America doesn't invent everything, but America has the ability to take those ideas and turn them into mass-produced items for war. Radar, sonar, all sorts of other things. The computer you see on the screen in the center, the first computer had no memory. It was for computing things for the war. And then the Manhattan Project to produce the atomic bomb. It was a theory. It largely came out of Europe. People had convinced FDR we needed to do something with this. And within about 3 years, we went from idea to a functional bomb. Nobody else could do that. African Americans in the war are going to play a big part. But this time, unlike World War I, they're going to demand that they get their rights out of it. See, they had gone to World War I, they had volunteered or been drafted and gone off willingly to that war with the expectation that they would then kind of earn their citizenship as a result of that. But it didn't really happen. In many cases, they came back to the same segregated treatment, especially in the South, that they had left. Not all parts of the country are like that, but especially in the South, that is the big problem. And so they said, we're going to get our rights. We'll do our duty, but we're going to get our rights out of it. And this really is the catalyst for the civil rights movement that we usually talk about in the 1950s and 1960s. So one of the first things was, with all this massive industrial production that was going on, especially in the South, there was a refusal to hire African Americans for those jobs. And so they threatened, under Philip Randolph, he was sort of a leader, threatened a march on Washington in the middle of war to demand access to those jobs. Now, President Roosevelt couldn't let that happen, right? It would just, the optics, public relations of it would look terrible. We're fighting a war against evil governments, and this doesn't really look good. And so as a result of that, to sort of thwart that march, he's going to create the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which is going to oversee ensuring that African Americans get access to those jobs, because these are skilled jobs in many cases. And if you can get in on the bottom, you might learn skills and be able to move up to the top, sort of like Booker T. Washington had always preached earlier in the century. And so they are going to get access to those jobs. Other court cases are going to come about, and we'll talk about these more when we get to civil rights, so I'll skip that for now. The other aspect of this is America had a segregated army. Now, this had come out of the Civil War, and it just had remained to that day. And so we have an all-black army, and then we have an all-white army. And coming out of this war, we're going to realize how stupid that is. And I'll have a few things to say about that just a little bit later in the slides. It's just a stupid thing. Anybody who's been to combat knows. The skin color doesn't matter, right? What matters, that the person fighting next to you has your back. That's all that matters. And we kind of figure that out towards the end of this war. And so, as I said, this is going to be a catalyst for the civil rights movement almost immediately after the war. President Truman is going to begin the process of desegregating the U.S. military. One black spot on America is the internment of Japanese Americans. Now, internment is a normal policy of war, right? Under the laws of war, if I go to war with a country, citizens of that country who are in my country can be interned. In other words, they can be held. They're not prisoners. They're just being held because they might support their country, which is my enemy. And so internment is a normal policy. And during the course of this war, we are going to intern Japanese, we're going to intern Germans, we are going to intern Italians, because we're at war with each of those countries. Now, the difference is this. For the Japanese, we are going to intern everybody of Japanese ancestry living within about 100 miles of the coast. So all the way down from Washington down to Southern California, if you're within about 100 miles of the coast, you are going to be told to report for internment and sent to camps all over the West. And you can see some of them marked on this map there. And so the problem is this. Unlike, as I described, with Germans and Italians, this is Japanese and Japanese Americans. Americans who just happen to be of Japanese ancestry. And the difference there is what? If you're born here, you have civil rights. The Japanese who have migrated here don't have those civil rights. But if you're born here, you're an American citizen, so you're due due process rights. And so this is really a stain, but I want you to understand the context. Remember, he's going to order this in early 1942. Executive Order 9066 is FDR's order to do this. Now, in January, February, March of 1942, it looks like we might lose this war. It doesn't look good. And they have sunk a chunk of our fleet out there in Hawaii. They have rapidly conquered all of Southeast Asia. We fear that they may attack that West Coast. And in fact, they are going to carry out small attacks. Now, these are relatively small attacks, but because of secrecy and suppression of free speech over the issue of those attacks, rumors spread even greater. So people believe the Japanese are doing more than they actually did. And so it leads to fear of what might happen. And so the very real fear, and we don't know what the Japanese plan is, are they planning to attack the West Coast? And if they attack the West Coast, is it possible some of those Japanese might support them? And if we don't know that, in a time of war, people are going to err on the side of taking care of the problem. So I'm not justifying it, I want you to understand it. And so all of those Japanese Americans within the exclusion zone are going to be forced to report for internment. Now, if you live here in Texas and you're Japanese, it doesn't affect you. And in fact, there are Japanese living here in Texas. Now, some South American countries, for instance, Peru, is going to send their Japanese up here for internment. And a lot of them are going to end up staying here after the war. And there are other South American countries that are going to send their Japanese up here, and they're going to be down in Texas. If you can see on the map of southern Texas there, Crystal City is where many of those people end up. Now, this is a big problem. But let me say something else first. We do intern some German Americans and some Italian Americans. But the rule of thumb there is if somebody makes an accusation against a German American, in other words, somebody whose parents were German but they were born here, if somebody makes an accusation against them, then probably the FBI is going to grab you and you're going to end up being interned. But if you're just a German American who's going to college and not causing any problems and doesn't look like you're worshiping Hitler, you're probably going to be okay. So there are a few German Americans and Italian Americans. The difference is it's all Japanese Americans along the coast, and that's where most Japanese Americans live. During the course of the war, a number of those people are going to bring a lawsuit demanding their civil rights. It's going to go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of FDR. No Supreme Court is going to take the power of the president away in wartime. And so just keep that in mind. After the war, we're going to try to make good on this. We're going to have some settlement claims and finally settle it in 1988. But the problem is, for those people, in many cases, they've lost everything. They lost their farm, their business, their homes, and they have to start from scratch all over again. And so it's a stain, but I want you to understand the context of that event. Now, the war in Western Europe, we're going to do one screen here very quickly. So we go to war 1941, immediately begin building up this giant army, but it's an untrained army. It's unexperienced at all. And so you don't want to send that army directly up against the main German army for their first attempt. And so we spend about a year building this army, preparing it, sending it to Britain. And in December of 1942, so a year after we entered the war, we conducted an invasion in North Africa. And this was the biggest amphibious invasion America had ever done to that point. And we made a lot of mistakes in the course of fighting the Germans up there. And so it was probably good we did this. We learned some lessons, we fired some commanders, and consolidated control up there. And then by 1943, we're going to do an amphibious invasion in Sicily. And again, this one's even bigger. Got airborne troops coming in, all sorts of things. Again, a lot of problems, but it is ultimately successful. Now, the decision is made, and we'll talk here in a moment why. The decision is made to invade Europe directly through Italy. Now, that might look good on a map, but you have to understand Italy is a peninsula, which means any attack is going to be a frontal assault against the Germans and Italians. And Italy is a very rocky, mountainous place, which means every fight is going to be uphill against an entrenched, well-trained army. And so we're going to conduct a number of invasions into southern Italy. And literally, we're going to be spending the rest of the war fighting our way up, trying to get out of Italy. We never really make it out of there before the end of the war. Now, in the background for all of that, though, we are preparing for the main invasion. And so our army by 1944 is a pretty well-trained, well-equipped, you could argue the best equipped army in the world. We have been massing troops in Great Britain for an invasion, which we call D-Day, Operation Overlord. D-Day just simply, in military verbiage, simply means the day you do the attack. So D-Day is the day of the attack. And so we conduct an invasion into Normandy in France, and then shortly thereafter, another invasion into southern France. And we spend the rest of the time, along with the British and the Canadians, fighting our way across Europe, trying to link up with the Russians who are coming across from Russia into Poland and into Germany. And so that's really the war in Europe in a nutshell. That Operation Overlord is, by many arguments, the largest amphibious invasion in world history. Now, we'll talk about another one that kind of, depending on how you want to calculate it, might be the biggest one. But you can make a good argument that that's the largest amphibious invasion in world history, the largest there will ever be. There'll never be anything like that again. So during the course of the war, a number of meetings are going to be held among the Allies to coordinate their movements. And so after that invasion into North Africa, FDR and Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, are going to meet in Casablanca in North Africa to discuss the war. And they make an agreement that they are only going to accept unconditional surrender from the Germans. We're not going to negotiate, unconditional surrender. Now, why do we do that? Well, remember what had happened after World War I. The Germans didn't believe they had lost, and as a result of that, their sort of anger had festered and in some ways had resulted in World War II. And we're not going to let them get away with that thought this time. We're going to demand unconditional surrender. You're going to know that you lost. The problem with that is if you tell your enemy unconditional surrender, how are they going to respond? They're going to fight to the death. So it means it's going to be a harder fight, but we have to do that. So understand, you got to do some hard things sometimes, and this is a hard thing you have to do. You have to demand unconditional surrender. We can't let them weasel out of this, but it means it's going to be a hard fight. Now, shortly thereafter, in Tehran, Iran, the big three, and so you see Stalin, FDR, and Churchill are going to meet and discuss the war on the bigger stage here. And one of the things Stalin wants is a second front. He wants the Allies actively engaged in Europe to draw off forces from that he's fighting. The big war really is happening in the Soviet Union. And, why does he do that? He wants to make sure we don't make a deal with Germany. Allies are not your, loved ones, right? Allies are with you because you share an interest. We share no other interest with the Soviet Union except we both want to defeat Germany. And Stalin doesn't really trust us. And so he's demanding a second front. We're going to agree, we're going to do that because we want to keep them on board, because if he gives up, we're going to have a tougher nut to crack. So, understand. Nobody really trusts each other. We trust Churchill, but that's a different thing. So we agree to a second front, and that's how we end up with that invasion of Italy. We had made an agreement, and so this was kind of the least we could do that lived up to that agreement, because we weren't ready for the main invasion that following year. Now, 1944 is an election year, and I probably told you in class, in 1940, FDR ran for a third term, which was unprecedented. And at that time, you can make an argument that FDR was really the only political leader who had the chance to be president, who understood the problem in a way that it was going to take in order to fight this war. Now, we could fight this forever, but I think you can make a good argument that he was really the only person. And so maybe it was the right decision for America in 1940 for him to do that unprecedented third term. The difference in 1944 is this. By the summer of 1944, so well before the election, the people around FDR, and I have to believe FDR himself, knew he was dying. He was an extremely unhealthy person. People would come out of meetings, almost in tears at what they had seen in dealing with this guy. He was an invalid, and he chose to run again. And this is one of the greatest disservices anybody who's ever run for president has done to America. He knows he's dying. The people around him know he's dying, and yet they lie to the American people to get him reelected again in 1944, and within 4 months, he's dead. Now, he chooses another vice president, and that's another whole story, because the sitting vice president was kind of tainted by communist connections. There were spies working with him, all sorts of nefarious stuff. And so he had to get a new vice president. He picks Senator Truman from Missouri. Now, if you know you're unhealthy and possibly going to die, and you have a new vice president, how would you treat that vice president? If you're a person thinking beyond your own ego, you would make sure that that person is in every meeting, knows everything that you know, so that they could step into your shoes on a moment's notice. But that's not what he does. Truman is just kind of left in the dark. And so as a result of that, when Truman becomes president in April, he doesn't know anything. He's not been in the deals that have been made. He's not aware of the atomic bomb that we're working on. And so I say it's one of the greatest disservices any person who ran for president has ever done. Now, you can see in terms of the victory, it's one of the lowest victories that he had gotten, 53%, quite a drop from his high water mark of 61% popular vote. The Republicans are kind of rebounding. So in 1944, they're kind of thinking, hey, maybe the next election we'll be able to win that one. So they're kind of looking forward to 1948, and they are going to get control of Congress the following year in election 1946. So you can see the rebound of Republicans there across the center of the country. The Democrats still in their deep, dark blue southern stronghold there. Now, as we found ourselves across Northern Europe, France, Belgium, that region, we were carrying out a bombing campaign on the German cities. Now, in many ways, you have to think of this as payback, because the Germans had begun the bombing of civilian centers. They had, in the opening days of the war, bombed Warsaw. They had bombed Amsterdam. They had bombed all these cities across Europe as they had conquered Europe, and then bombed London. Thousands of people killed in London in these bombings. And there's a saying, sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. In other words, you do something evil, that evil is going to be returned to you tenfold. And that is what's going to happen to Germany. We are going to be destroying their industrial base, but bombing in those days is not precise as it is today. We're trying to prevent them from building stuff. And in order to do that, we're going to bomb entire cities. And hundreds of thousands of people are going to die in some of those cities. The bombing of Dresden, you see in the picture here. Almost every major city in Germany, by the end of the war, looks like that. They're bombed out hulks. And you can feel about that how you want, right? We all have our own moral compass. You can look at it and say, well, that's terrible. We shouldn't have done that. There are arguments for and against the way we carried out that bombing. But I just want you to understand that phrase. You sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And Germany is going to reap that whirlwind for the evil that they have put upon the world. As we enter into Germany itself, we become aware of the enormity of the Holocaust, the rounding up of Jews and Romani and other ethnic groups, and especially in the case of the Jews, the attempt to remove them from Europe by killing them all off. And as we become aware of how systematic that system was, there's no feeling that we need to take care of the Germans. In fact, the orders, and we'll talk about it here in just a moment, the orders are to the soldiers as they go into Germany: you don't take care of them. They are responsible for themselves. See, we blame the German people for this war. That's going to be different than when we talk about Japan. We blame the German people, and the German people are going to pay for this war. And especially as we come across evils like the Holocaust, and they try to say, oh, I didn't know anything about it. And it's clear they had to have known. And we know now from historical record, they knew. They just didn't want to know. So in Yalta in 1945, Yalta is the last of the big meetings that Roosevelt and Churchill are at. It's in southern Russia. You can see on the Black Sea there. And they meet in February. And if you look in that picture, you can see Roosevelt's near death. He looks sick, and he is as sick as he looks. He's going to die in April, early April. So he's got 2 months to live at that point. Stalin's pretty healthy. And Churchill, this is going to be his last meeting because he's going to be thrown out of office, not too distant future here. And at this meeting, they're going to make a number of decisions about the war. And so this is a pivotal meeting about what's going to happen. So one of the agreements was that Russia would enter the war against Japan within 6 months after defeating Germany. Now, we are demanding this because we know the war's going to last, we think, 2 more years. And we're probably going to need some help out there. We helped you in Europe. You need to help us there. But there's also another aspect to this. The aide to FDR is a guy that we now know was a Soviet spy. Okay? So by spy, I mean he's an agent of influence. He's a guy who's working on behalf of the Russians, but he's a State Department official in the government, and he's the main advisor for FDR. And so it's pretty likely that guy is getting FDR to maybe ask for things the Soviets want anyway, and getting FDR to give in on things that the Soviets want. And so we're going to give in a lot, and essentially we're going to sell out eastern part of Europe to communist control for the next 70 years or so as a result of this meeting. Now, the other main thing we're going to come out of this meeting with is unconditional surrender for Japan. We're going to tell the Japanese, just like Germany, unconditional surrender of your terms. That's it. Now, again, just like with Germany, it means they're going to fight to the death, but the difference is the Japanese are always going to fight to the death. They had no conception of surrender. They are fighting on behalf of the emperor. In their minds, the emperor is a god, and they have to be willing to die for that god. And so it was always going to be a bitter fight to the end. but we're just letting him know, no terms, meaning maybe you're going to lose the emperor. And so they're going to fight to the death and all of that stuff. The other thing is we discuss the dismemberment of Germany. What's going to happen to Germany? We're never going to let Germany do what they did again. Remember, they had invaded France in 1870. They had started World War I. They had started World War II. We're just not going to let that ever happen again. And so the plan is there won't be a Germany. We're just going to divide it up into sections. And there really is no belief that we're going to put it back together again. In the American context, we call this the Morgenthau Plan. And so Hans Morgenthau is the Secretary of the Treasury, and his staff draws up this plan. Now, the thing is, some of his staff are communists, and they're writing it in a way that's going to be beneficial to the Soviet Union. He doesn't know that, though. Now, the plan says we are not going to do anything for the recovery of Germany. It's going to be deindustrialized. Now, if you deindustrialize Germany, what does that mean? It means millions of people are going to die. That's just the reality. But we don't care because we view those German people as guilty of causing this war. Now, this is a statement from FDR. He wrote to Morgenthau about that plan. We have got to be tough with Germany, and I mean the German people, not just the Nazis. We either have to castrate the German people, or you've got to treat them in such a manner so they can't just go on producing people who want to continue the way they have in the past. Now, I don't think he really wanted to castrate the German people, but you understand the feeling towards the German people here. We're going to treat them harsh, and the orders to the American and Allied soldiers as they go into Germany is, you don't take care of them. If they starve to death, that's their problem. If they don't have enough coal to heat and they freeze to death, that's their problem. That's not our problem, because they are being conquered. They are not being liberated. Everybody understand the difference on that? And so that policy is going to change, and we'll talk about that in class. But I just want you to understand, when we enter Germany, we are entering as conquerors of a defeated people, and they know they have been defeated. Now, the war in the Pacific. The war in the Pacific, you can see on this map, the central difficulty is, how do we get close enough to Japan in order to begin bombing Japan in order to prepare for an invasion of Japan? And it's the tyranny of distance here. You have to get some little islands where you can set up some bomber bases, but they got to be close enough to fly to Japan and fly back. And that's what we're going to be fighting the war for. And so it means the entire war is a series of amphibious invasions. And you can see on this list here, what do we got? 78 different invasions conducted. And I want you to think about what it takes for each one of those invasions. We have to get a giant fleet with battleships, aircraft carriers, transport, supply ships, hospital ships, all of that. And they got to sail up to some tiny little island about the size of our campus and bomb the crap out of that island for days to weeks in some cases, because we learn over time that days doesn't work. It takes weeks, and even then there's going to be a lot of survivors. And then we have to get a bunch of guys, put them into landing craft, send them into the beach. And as we find out again and again, the Japanese are waiting there, and these guys are running into a hail of machine guns, and it's a bitter, bitter fight. The Japanese are trained not to surrender. They will fight to the death, which means if you want to fight the Japanese, it is a fight to the death. We'll take all these islands, but the casualties are going to be extensive, and almost no Japanese will be captured because they will fight to the death. And we take an island, what do you got to do? Prepare to take the next island a little closer and keep working your way closer and then move your way close enough to Saipan, which is kind of in the center of this map, where it was close enough for the bombers, and then begin bombing. But then we need to capture an island close enough, Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands, to the south of Japan, and use that as the base to attack and do an invasion into Japan. And so that's the story of the entire Pacific War here. It is a bitter fight, and we call this the island hopping campaign. You don't have to take every single island, but we got to take some islands and keep moving closer. And we're going to leave some Japanese on some islands that we just leave them there, and they'll probably be cut off and starved to death. In many cases, that's what will happen. At the same time, we're carrying out submarine warfare on the Japanese, and by the end of the war have essentially destroyed the Japanese Navy and most of their merchant fleet. We begin bombing Japan by 1944, and then in 1945, we take the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And so this animation here sort of captures that movement across the Pacific Ocean there. And by 1944, we are on the island of Okinawa. Now, Okinawa is critical because that's the island from which we can conduct the invasion into Japan. Okinawa is a tiny little island. If you look at this, it is about 67 miles long, so about the distance to the south side of Austin from here. And at the narrowest point, it's only 3 miles. The widest point's 12 miles. So this is a very narrow rope in the sea, very mountainous. It's a beautiful place if you ever get a chance to go there. It's kind of like Hawaii. And it's defended by about 77,000 Japanese troops who are going to fight to the death, and they do. Very few of them are captured. And the Japanese, or Okinawan civilians, have been indoctrinated with this idea of emperor worship and all of that. They have also been told the U.S. Marines are cannibals and they will eat you. They are terrified of the Americans that come in. And this is the first place where we're really going to face kamikaze suicide bombers. And so you see in this picture here, a plane flying in, diving in on a ship. The Navy's going to suffer its heaviest casualties of the war in battle in this fight because of those suicide planes. And you can see the number of casualties here. Okinawan civilians are going to be devastated by this because they're caught in the middle. They've been told they're going to be eaten alive. And so they're hiding with the soldiers, which means when we kill the soldiers, we're killing civilians as well. For Americans, we lose 14,000 dead and, many more casualties in the course of this war or this battle. And it's here that we really understand how hard it's going to be to invade Japan itself. We become fully cognizant of how difficult that fight is going to be. They are going to fight to the death, and the people have been trained to fight to the death. And they would rather die than be captured. Down at the southern point of Okinawa, there's a place called Suicide Cliffs. And as the American soldiers approached, women with their babies in their arms would jump off the cliffs, hundreds of people to their death, rather than being taken prisoner by the Americans. And so that we know that's what we're going to face when we go into Japan. So the landing had gone easy, but once we got inland, the fighting became very difficult. It's in the midst of this fighting that FDR dies. And again, it was a great disservice. When Truman is sworn in, he all of a sudden has the entire weight of this war and has not been brought up to snuff. And in fact, is briefed at that time that we got this thing we're working on, an atomic bomb. It's the first he had heard about it. It had been so secret. Now, after the defeat of Germany in May, we have one last big meeting from the war, and that is at Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin, Germany. And so Truman goes to Potsdam and meets with the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Stalin. And so we have two new people in Stalin. During the course of this meeting, Truman is told that the experiment worked. What was the experiment? The atomic bomb. We had tested the first atomic bomb and it worked. And so he is told that secretly. Now, the British knew we were working on this because we're working on it together. But as I said, we don't really trust the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union hadn't been brought into this plan to build this atomic bomb. So Truman knows that we have an atomic bomb. Attlee knows we're building an atomic bomb. But at the same moment that Truman's told it worked, Stalin is told it's worked because he had spies in our system. And so there were enough spies that almost exactly the same time, he finds out we have this atomic bomb. So Stalin knows we have a bomb. Truman knows that we have a bomb, but he doesn't know Stalin knows we have a bomb. And it's in that context, the knowledge that we have this bomb, that we once again put forth that unconditional surrender demand on the Japanese. But this time we say unconditional surrender or suffer complete annihilation. Now, when we say that, we understand we have this new tool. And we are also stepping up the bombing of Japan itself with regular bombs. And you see this leaflet here on the screen, dropping bombs over Japan. In Japan, we're dropping leaflets on those cities. So again, unlike the Germans, we blame the German people. We're not dropping leaflets on them. They're just going to die. We don't care. But in Japan, we're going to drop leaflets. And those leaflets on the back side are saying, hey, we declare that the cities on the front, so each of those circles is a city. Each of those cities is a military target. Leave that city and save your life. So we're trying to give the Japanese people fair warning that we're going to destroy all of those cities, and we're dropping these leaflets on those cities. Two of those cities are Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So eventually those are the two that are going to get the first atomic bombs. But in the meantime, we are bombing, probably killing 100,000 people a day in some of these bombing runs. We're dropping incendiary bombs on Tokyo. And I want you to think about what the cities in Japan are made of in that time. They're mostly made of wood and paper. And you drop an incendiary bomb on that, and it's going to create a mass fire. And that's what's happening in many of these Japanese cities. They're becoming burned out hulks by the time we get to August of 1945. And even with that, the Japanese are not giving up. Now, in the background of all this, we are already planning for the invasion of Japan. And so you see this map here, the plan for the first invasion. This whole thing is called Operation Downfall. The first part was Operation Olympic. And you can see this would have been the largest invasion in world history, would have dwarfed anything we had done up to that point. 14 divisions, 42 aircraft carriers. This is set in stone. It's going to go on 1 November. It's already set. It's not going to change unless something changes it. And so we are bringing troops in. We are bringing the mass of supplies in order to fight that battle. Troops who are in Germany are being brought in across the United States, put on ships, being sent out here to fight. Guys who have been fighting across the Pacific, they know they're going back in for one more time, and it will probably be their last time. And the plan for this one is to attack the southern island, Kyushu, because we need that as a base to invade the other islands. So understand this, all of that is to mass forces to take that one smaller island down there. Now, the following March, Operation Coronet, the plan is to take 40 divisions and about 100 aircraft carriers and all the other ships and invade the main island, Honshu of Japan. Now that one's not set in stone. It depends on how this first invasion goes, right? It could be delayed or pushed up, but the planning date is March 1st. November 1st, set in stone. It's going to happen. And the guys out there in the Pacific know that that's what they're going to do. And they know, based upon what had happened in Okinawa, the chances of survival are pretty slim. And we have to start planning for the casualties. So you see on this slide here, the military is planning that the U.S. is going to suffer 456,000 casualties and 109,000 dead in the first 90 days of that first invasion. The second invasion, we're expecting 1.2 million casualties, 267,000 dead. And so I want you to understand what that means. In just the invasion of Japan, we are expecting as many dead as we lost in the entire rest of the war. That's what that means. Now, we also have to plan for potential civilian casualties. And Japanese, we expect 5 to 10 million dead, based upon the way they had conducted themselves in Okinawa. That is not really a Japanese island. It's Japanese owned, but they're a different people. And if they were willing to do that, what are the Japanese people on the homelands going to do? You see this quote from a young high school girl. Everybody is being trained to fight the Americans. And she says, even killing one American soldier will do. You have to aim for the abdomen. She was given a pointy stick, told to run up and kill somebody. She's going to die, but that's what she's going to do because it is her duty to the emperor to do that. So that never happens. And it never happens because of the atomic bomb. As devastating as the atomic bomb is, far fewer people are killed as a result of that. But because we had to prepare for this war, we had built so much supplies, all the stuff you need for war, body bags, the bombs, the bullets, rations, all of that stuff had to be produced. And America was producing so much stuff by this point. And so just as an example, we produced 500,000 Purple Heart medals. That's the medal you get if you're a casualty, wounded or killed in combat. And so we produced 500,000 Purple Heart medals to prepare for this battle. Because the battle never happened, we still have Purple Heart medals left over from World War II. So with all the wars we've fought since World War II, if you get a Purple Heart medal today, it was made for the invasion that never happened. When I was in Afghanistan, 2007, we were still dropping bombs that were made for the invasion that never happened. In other words, we fought the Korean War, we fought Japan or Vietnam, we fought all these other wars. And with all those wars, we still have stuff left over from World War II that was never used because we never invaded Japan. And the reason is because of the atomic bomb. Now, we can debate the morality, all of that stuff, but I want you to understand the context. And the context is the competing casualties and what would have happened had we taken a different decision. So in August of 1942, we had enough material to produce 3 atomic bombs. That's all we had. It's going to be a couple of months before we have enough stuff to build more atomic bombs. But at that point, in July, we had enough for 3 bombs. The first bomb was that test bomb you see down in the lower right corner, right? It looks like a science experiment because it was. We didn't know if it was going to work. It was the test and it worked. So now we got literally 2 bombs worth of material left. And so in August 6, 1945, we're going to drop Little Boy on Hiroshima. About 50,000 people are going to be killed outright. Others will die of other things over the years. But again, far less than would have died in an invasion. And at that point, we once again reiterated the demand, unconditional surrender. Japan refused to surrender. And so 3 days later, we dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki, and once again demanded unconditional surrender. Now, at this point, the emperor said, we have to swallow the bitter poison, we have to surrender. And at that point, a number of military officers attempted to overthrow the emperor so they could continue fighting. So some people will argue, hey, well, we should have done a test, off the coast and show them we got this big scary bomb. If we had done that, would it have scared the Japanese? No, we blew up a city and it didn't scare them. And if we had done that, we would have had one bomb left. And one bomb didn't seem to be enough to force them to surrender. And so we can all feel about this however we want, but just understand, had we done that, it would have meant the invasion in November and would have meant 5 million, 10 million dead Japanese and close to 400,000 dead Americans. On the other side of that, I want you to put yourself in Truman's shoes. Is there any way he could not make this decision? See, let's say he decided, hey, this bomb's too scary, we're not going to do this. We're going to do the invasion. But then after the war, the American people became aware that we had this bomb and he chose not to use it. Do you think he would survive that? I don't. Hundreds of thousands of families would be just angry at him because their loved ones died because he chose not to use this tool that he had. So this is a complex decision, and again, we all have our own moral frameworks, but I want you to understand that context as it really was, not some fictional hope that we might have sitting here 70 or 80 years after the fact. So why did the Allies win? In large part, it is that industrial capacity that America has. Had we not joined the war, Britain would have been forced to surrender. There's no question. And it's questionable what would have happened between the Russians and the Germans, right? At some point, I think they would have just run out of energy and it just would have ended somehow. And then the superior technology, our ability to harness that, the appeal of democracy, right? That saying, hey, we're bringing freedom, all of that stuff. It doesn't always work out as well as we wanted, but to a degree it does. So casualties in this war. So this is showing each country. The orange is civilian, the red is military casualties. And as you can see, the Russians by far suffer the most casualties. And the numbers keep going up as people reevaluate it. 25 million easy, about half civilian, half military casualties. China, not far behind, roughly 20 million, but most of those are civilians. The Japanese invasion of China is devastating for the Chinese people. If you go down, you look at America, very few civilian, it doesn't even show up. Very small number of military. And so it'd be easy to say, well, we're not important. Without America's effort, the war doesn't end the same way. Russia couldn't have kept fighting. Germany might have gotten a stalemate, right? This war would have turned out differently. So, very costly war. There will never be another war like this, although we may kill more people in the future. So, this last chart here is showing the difference by theater, and I just want to highlight that difference between the Western Front, which is where we invade Normandy and fight in France and all that area, versus the fighting in Russia. And you can see the scale of casualties. Most of the military deaths in this war are between the Germans and the Russians. You can see in our case, in Western Europe, those casualties were going quite a bit higher in 44 and then 45. The Pacific, down on the lower left-hand side, very low casualties in terms of numbers. But the fighting there is much more brutal. Because the Japanese are going to fight to the death, it means every fight is a fight to the death. right? If your enemy's not going to give up till they die, you have no choice but to do the same. And so it is much harsher fighting for the American soldiers and Marines fighting in the Pacific as opposed to those fighting in Europe there. And had we invaded Japan, those numbers would have ballooned up, as we just talked about. So that's the war, and we'll go ahead and leave off here, and we're going to talk about the after-war period. You know, there's a lot of hope when this war ends that things will be better, but we're very quickly going to move into a Cold War between us and the Soviet Union, because we are, as I said, allies, but allies are not your husband or wife, right? You're not married to those people. You have an interest, and that interest is defeating a common enemy. And once that enemy is defeated, your interests are going to diverge, and that's what's going to happen in the next phase of U.S. history.